Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. As you already know, I'm Masood Raja, and today we'll be talking about literature pedagogy in all its different manifestations. Now, please keep in mind that today I'm using a different streaming mechanism. I am actually streaming directly from my YouTube channel instead of using a third-party software. So I have never done this before. So please let me know how it goes. I think the best part of it is that as soon as you post your comments, I'll be immediately able to, access them, and there will be no delay. And also, I'm hoping there is no delay as I speak right now. So I'm waiting for people to join in. Just make sure, say hi, put your name in there so that I know you're here. And then, we'll start. Primarily, I will not be referring to any major theorists and all, even though my own ideas of literature pedagogy, of course, are theoretically informed and are informed by the works of scholars of pedagogy, scholars of literature. But where you feel the need, you can ask me for more focused engagement with it, and I can provide you the sources and everything else that my own opinions are based in. So thank you so much. So we have Razi Ahmed from India. Welcome, Razi, and hope this benefits you. And anyone else who comes in, just do let me know, and I will obviously like to greet you. And also do keep in mind that all these webinars, unless something happens and I cannot make it on Saturdays, we do this every Saturday on different topics. The topics are announced on the channel community page, as well as on our Facebook group and on my Twitter account. And I try to also send a couple of reminders so that people know about it. So, and if you can help pass this on to more people, I mean, these are free webinars, of course, and also being offered as widely as possible on quite a few wide-ranging subjects. So the more people that can benefit from these, the better it is. And plus, it is good for my soul to, interact with more people. So welcome back, Oroko. Good to see you back. Hope you all are well. And so I will start. I mean, so the way I think about pedagogy in general, but literature pedagogy in particular, is obviously inflected through my politics and through what I consider a humanistic education ought to do or ought to be about. So if you keep that in mind, that would give you the first principle of literature pedagogy, that it is what you want the outcomes to be, right? Because that will then decide your philosophy, but also your strategies, your in-class activities, what you prefer to teach. So let's assume that, like me, you believe that literature cannot just be taught simply that this is what a text means, but that it has a larger function, and that is that a good education in literature can enable our students to think about the text more reflectively, but to also go out and use that knowledge to see how the world works, what is just in it, what is unjust in it, and then try to make a difference in that world. Now, that mode of teaching is what we consider an ameliorative mode of teaching, a mode of teaching that presupposes that study of literature can make us into better people, and then can make us into people who want to go and change the world, make it better. Now, if you disagree with that, obviously, then your approach will be different. So there are people, very powerful scholars, who will tell you that's not your job as a literature professor. You're not there to teach your students how to be responsible global citizens. Your job is to teach the texts assigned in your course and enable your students to read them critically. And if you give them a critical consciousness, they will eventually become political, right? So they have a point, right? And we can delve deeper into that. But let me welcome some more people. So Infinita is here. Welcome. Abdullah Khan, welcome. This is Abdullah Khan. Your question is how to write a literature review in research or thesis. That is sadly not the topic what we are going to be talking about today. But towards the end, we may talk about it, but that is something that I am not trained in. I do not teach my students to write a literature review. In humanities, at least in United States, we try not to write like social sciences. So in so many ways, I can't even claim any kind of expertise. I have never written a literature review formalistically as the social scientists write, even though most of the things we do have a literature review in our articles and even in our books. But maybe we'll get to that with a caveat that I probably am not the best person to ask that question. So coming back to the question of literature pedagogy. Okay, so as I told you, there are competing schools of thought. I will mostly dwell on how my own pedagogy is shaped, why, and how do I try to accomplish it, right? And then anything that you want to add to it or want to, add your own experiences of learning, but also if you have taught, your experiences of teaching will be very helpful in making this, this conversation even more enriching. So technically, the way I was trained, my mentors and professors that I studied with were all critical scholars of critical pedagogy. And what I mean is that these are the people who had read their Paulo Freire and Henry Giroux and all the John Dewey even. These were the people who believed that a humanistic education, if delivered correctly or in a certain way, can go beyond just teaching the value of the text or the meaning of the text, but can also encourage our students to develop critical skills, of course, but also to develop more compassionate, ethical selves, the kind of selves that are sensitive to cultural differences, the kind of selves that are sensitive to the inequalities that exist in the world and then actually want to go and do something about it. And this doesn't apply to just literature majors. This applies to anyone who walks into our class. So that means that my belief system and the belief system of my mentors and our philosophy was that a literary education is more than just knowing what Conrad says or what Shakespeare means. It's more than that because it encourages that in the process of learning the literary text, we should also encourage our students to think the world differently, right? And then try to change it as they go out and do their work in the world. Now, that is what we call an ameliorative practice, a practice that believes that education ought to give more than just the skills, right? And that a humanistic education absolutely must focus on more than just giving our students technical skills to read literature, reproduce answers, and write about it, but develop deeper modes of thinking and praxis, right? Now, how do we accomplish it? How do we do it? That differs widely between which practices we focus on. What do we focus on? And I apologize. I'm using my own self as a reference, right? But the reason is that I can only talk about this in terms of a self-reference because I have, 20 years of teaching experience, but 20 years of consciously teaching in a certain specific way, right? In a way in which I try to make sure that what I do in my classroom has implications outside the classroom. So that's what we'll be moving on to. Let me take a look at the questions first and see. Cool. Razi, I absolutely will be happy to answer this question, but if you keep an eye out on our topics, every now and then on a Saturday, we have an open question answer session where there is no topic, right? So everyone comes in with their questions, and then we try to answer these, and that would be the right venue for me to try to answer these questions. But you're welcome, of course. Of course, today I want to stick to the topic because that's the expectation of the people who have joined us. That's what we had advertised, right? So that's how I would like to stick to that. AC, hello, Dr. Raja. I was just about to ask you to describe your own pedagogy. Thank you. And by the way, my views on my own pedagogy actually, of course, are published in my articles, but also, I did an edited volume a few years ago on critical pedagogy. So my views on pedagogy are a matter of public record. They are also on the channel. There are quite a few videos that do discuss my views on pedagogy. So Oroko, my professor always tells us that literature should humanize us. It should make us better humans with regards to how interact with the world around us. So you see, you're so lucky to have a professor like that. Of course, our idea of what constitutes humanizing can be different. But any professor who walks into your class and tells you, I'm going to teach you these texts, but the purpose is not just to master how the mechanics of the text work or how you can write erudite scholarship about it, but that we will use these novels to learn about what happens in the lives of these characters, right? In the process, we will also guide ourselves and think about how do we feel about it? How do we think about the text and why? And then how do we take that knowledge and find corresponding real life situations in the world and see what our role is in it, right? And so in that sense, you are a really lucky student to have a professor like that. Now, in my classes, I always use two questions to frame my course. And the questions are, I encourage my students to do two things. When they read a novel or a short story, I ask them, ask yourself, why do I think about this book or this? Why do I think like this? If I'm reading a story and certain thoughts about characters or story are coming to mind, I need to ask myself, why do I think about it like that? And then if a story makes me feel a certain way, I need to ask myself, why do I feel the way I feel, right? So if they start answering these two questions, what it covers is the entire realm of human experience, reason, and the aesthetics, the feelings, right? And the idea is that would help them, that would encourage them to question their own assumptions about people, right? For example, let's say you are reading a sign, right? Right now in Pakistan, those of you who are joining me from Pakistan, every year when the Women's Month comes along, the Women's March becomes a huge issue, right? So some men respond to it differently, others respond to it differently. So in personal terms, if you look at women marching in the street and you're uncomfortable with it, that's not a natural position, right? So you ask yourself, why do I feel like this? What is it about this act that troubles me? And that will enable you to question your own assumptions, to question your own prejudices, right? So these are the two questions that I frame my teaching with, right? And then what informs my teaching is the people I have interacted with, people I have read, people who have explained how to do a kind of literary practice and pedagogy that is beyond the text, that goes beyond the text and tries to mobilize literature to teach Not one single way of living, no, but to teach some kind of compassionate form of living, a kind of life in which we don't just judge people, right? We try to figure out how to understand our others without expecting them to be like us. And then to share, to feel as human beings, what are our responsibilities to each other and what are our obligations to each other. So that is what grounds my pedagogy, regardless of whether I'm teaching a graduate class or an undergraduate class. And that, if you sum it up, is one form of what we call critical pedagogy, right? So I'll come back to the topic. Let me look at the questions. Oroko, good, I got yours. So Abdullah Khan, on which day do you have a free questions day? So good question. So usually we do these webinars on Saturdays. So if you keep an eye out on our community page, whenever it's a general webinar, it will say general questions and answers. And that way you will know when it will happen, right? But by and large, if nothing else happens in my life, we meet every Saturday around this time. And the regulars here, Oroko and Infinita and others, they already know about it. Okay, AAC. Quick question. If I would like to teach with the intention of making the world a better place, how do I do so without pushing my interpretation of text onto my own students? That's a very good question. So here is the deal. We all have politics, right? And we always are interpellated by our political positions, right? Now, I teach in Texas. Not all my students are liberal, progressive students. But I'm a leftist, right? I believe in certain modes of thinking. Now, some people do it in a very aggressive manner, right? That totally defies the purpose of that kind of critical pedagogy, because they just like, my point of view is the only right point of view and yours is not. No. So you approach it with humility. What I do in my classes very openly is I tell my students, look, I am left of any left that you can imagine, but you don't have to be like me to do well in this class. I will respect your opinions. If you want to debate them, I will debate them with you. But at the end of the day, the purpose of the course isn't for you to think like me. I will try to do what I deem is good for us as human beings and as the world. You have the absolute right to disagree with me, right? In the process of disagreeing with each other, we'll be respectful to each other. And that always works. Remember, any act of transformation in a classroom must start with a certain degree of humility. You cannot have hard positions, and you cannot absolutely say it's my way or the highway. And so a certain degree of humility and openness always helps, and the patience to hear your students out. The idea is you're trying to encourage them to think differently. The only way you can encourage them to think differently is if you encourage them and if you let them know that their thoughts will be respected and they will not be derided or made fun of, right? That's the first question. But the kind of pedagogy that one of my colleagues does, one of the leading scholars of critical pedagogy is Mark Pracker. He's my former colleague. And I think his approach is more scientific than mine. And for example, he has studied people who have done research on the brain, on consciousness, how does our consciousness work, everything else. I have very extensive recorded lectures on his work. And what he does in his class is he has some leading questions. Let's say he's teaching a novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the leading questions would usually be, okay, this is what is happening to a slave here. What does it make you feel? Right? Or this enslaved woman is being treated like this. Can you share your feelings about it? Right? So when I was teaching with him, sometimes we will have students who will share our classes, right? And I'll ask them, I was like, how is your class going with Dr. Bracker? And they were like, it's like by second week, we know what kind of an answer he wants from us. Because his idea is that you only alter people's mental schemas through repetition, right? And so I was like, so what do you guys do? And it's like when he asks us, oh, this slave is being tortured, what does it make you feel? And obviously we tell him, oh my God, this makes me feel bad and it's terrible and unjust, right? So I went to Mark and I said, Mark, your students are telling me that they just invent orders. And he laughed at me and he's like, that is the point, right? He said, our mental schemas are built in a way that they encourage us to perform a certain identity, right? We perform an identity because of them. So he said, in my classroom for one semester, 40 minutes every other week, if they perform a compassionate, empathetic identity, right? That performance is actually altering their mental schemas because they are doing something which they probably have never done before, right? If let's say it's a student who's a racist, but to get an A in the class for one semester, he or she performs an identity that is not racist, but that is sympathetic to the plight of the others. He said, if done repeatedly in a course, the scientific research tells me that the mental schemas of that student would shift because performing an empathetic identity towards others has now become part of his lived performative experience. And that made absolute sense to me, right? Now, I don't do it like that. I'm not that technical about it, right? But I do make sure that my students know that their opinions will be respected, unless they end up being racist or sexist opinions or any homophobic, then I have to correct them on that, right? Because that is hurtful to my students who might be, women or gay or lesbians in my class. So I have to protect them. But other than that, differences of political opinion absolutely doesn't matter. It actually encourages better discussions in a class. But you come to it from a point of humility, and that has always worked for me. Okay. Good. So AC, there is quite a lot of other texts on cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan pedagogy as well. What I'll do is I will list some of the texts when I post a edited version of this, but you can start with Martha Nussbaum, right? Poetic Justice. This was one of the most groundbreaking book. Any work by Henry Giroux, any work by Mark Bracker, and there are quite a few other scholars of critical pedagogy, and of course Paulo Freire, right? You cannot do this kind of pedagogy without really understanding Paulo Freire, and for that, there is a whole series of lectures that I'm developing by actually reading the book and talking about it on the channel, and it's available, and I highly recommend it. So I have another question by Irfan Naik. A lot of things has been explored in post-colonial literature. If a scholar wants to do PhD on post-colonial lit, what sub-area he should choose? And is there any scope in post-colonial area now? Well, this is not relevant to today's talk, but I will make it relevant. Okay, so depending on where you are, if you're in Pakistan or India, there isn't a lot of research on pedagogy in post-colonial nation states, right? If you look at educational systems, right, Gauri Vishwanathan has a book, right, on the colonial educational system. Dr. Shahzeb from Punjab University just recently finished a dissertation on it. So if you want to do post-colonial studies in a literature department, why not challenge the assumptions of literature departments and see what colonial legacies they still employ in the classroom, but also in what they consider a good post-colonial or good literature program. And then that could be focused on theories of pedagogy, but pertinent to your own nation, your own subculture. And is there any scope for it? There will always be scope for political work and post-colonial studies. It has inexhaustible areas of interest. And so I have no doubt about it. Now, would you get a job in it? That depends on the job market. But can you do scholarship in it? Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so coming over to the questions of pedagogy again. I think in 2006, I published an article in Radical Teacher about my experience of teaching a world literature course. And in that, what I was trying to rely on was early works of Mark Brocker, right? To explain what's the place of a text in my class, right? Now, if you're a traditionally trained scholar and teacher, you might fall into a certain category of teaching practices. That is what Mark Brocker calls the discourse of the master. And these are professors who have a lot of knowledge, right? But they walk into a class, and what they are interested in their students is that their students should be able to display the kind of mastery that the teachers have. And doing well means that they should learn the ways of the teacher. And the teaching is a performance. You are there, you are the star, right? And everyone else is there to emulate you, right? And that isn't a very effective mode of teaching, because you're not teaching them anything. You're just teaching them, here is how you become a professor. There's another one, which is the discourse of the discipline, where we try to encourage our students, if you read these books and articles, then you will be a specialist in Victorian studies or post-colonial studies. And most of their energies are spent on learning the discipline itself, right? Against that is what we call the critical pedagogy. And the purpose of the critical pedagogy is to teach literature, but to teach it with the hope that by reading someone else's story, someone from the global south, someone who has had a different kind of lived experience, our students will first of all read the story and see them as fellow human beings, and then also see their own place, cultural and individual, vis-a-vis these people who are being oppressed. Not see them as victims who need to be rescued, but fellow human beings who are living in terrible conditions. So it enables you to see your own position in the world and how are you implicated in that project of oppression, one. And two, encouraging your students to think about how can we change it? And if we cannot change it, how can we at least think differently about it, right? And what that does is, it doesn't matter what their major is going to be. You have to connect it to their life. What that starts them thinking, you hope, is that literature classroom isn't just about learning a few things and reproducing them in an essay, but that reading and reading critically can enrich their lives personally, but can also help them think the world differently, think their own jobs differently, think their own experiences differently. And then they go out in the world and start becoming the change. I mean, I'm teaching right now a class of highly intelligent students, undergraduate. These are students that are selected by the state of Texas after 10th grade, top 10% of the high schools in the state of Texas, right? And they come to us for the last 2 years of high school and they take college classes. All of these students are going places. They are going to study technology, medicine, engineering. Not a single one of them is going to be a literature student. So the way I'm teaching that class is, every time we read a story, I connect it to their idea of what did they learn from it, factually and otherwise, culturally and otherwise. But what kind of a lesson does it teach them as to how to interact with people, how to treat other people, right? And then I encourage them, okay, take this knowledge and think of your future profession. If you're a doctor, if you're an engineer, a software engineer, how would this enable you to become a kind of human who helps others, but who's also respected by others because he or she helps others? And by and large, you will see from their reactions that that works better than me just saying, read this story and I'll do a quiz and I'll do a midterm and then you'll answer those questions. No, it's not about, if you make it pedantic, then critical pedagogy doesn't work because it's still top down. So what do I do in my classes to at least create an aura of a democratic educational system? After all, it's very hard to eradicate your position as an authority figure in a hierarchical classroom. So I tell my students openly that if you find an assignment that you think doesn't enable you to learn better, or rather hinders your learning, you propose a change in the classroom. You say, Dr. Aja, I have a motion. And I say, what is your motion? That instead of having quizzes, which make us feel bad if we even lose 1 point, we should write a 2-page journal once a week. So then we go like, do you have a second? Someone seconds it, right? And then you say, let's vote. So if it carries the majority, right, you change the assignment. But then you also have 6 or 7 students who wanted to take quizzes, right? You don't want to silence them, right? So you then say, okay, those of you who want to write a journal will write a journal every week. 6 of you were opposed to this motion. That means you're okay with the quizzes. For you, I will administer a quiz. So you've accommodated both groups, right? Because the purpose is to make them learn, right? But in the process, what they have also internalized is that they have a say in their own education, right? They may not be able to change the timing of the class. They may not be able to change how much we read, but they can at least lobby and vote as to how they will learn better, right? And so that is one strategy that I've often used, and it works well. It works well because students get to do what they like to do, still learning in the process, but it also symbolically and emotionally gives them this feeling that they are not silent, passive recipients of education in my classroom. So these are like some of the practical strategies that I have used. So like if I were to sum it up, literature pedagogy for me is ameliorative, which means is that teaching literary text and nuances of the text and everything is not the end point for me. It's the beginning point. So after you've gone through the technicalities of literary vocabularies and how to read a text and how to write about it, what I want to mobilize my classes, my pedagogy, is towards encouraging my students to become more responsible, compassionate, ethical beings in the world. They will become that, first of all, when they develop the critical skills to think about the world critically. How does the global economy work? How does oppression work, right? But they will only act upon that knowledge when they emotionally are also invested in that. So throughout, you're trying to help them see the world differently in critical terms, in factual terms, right? But you're also trying to encourage them to develop and strengthen their emotional responses and become more expansive. So if you are successful, then you will see by the end of the course, the students, if not fully transformed, would have been for once in their life exposed to a mode of thinking that helps them question their own assumptions, right? And tells them that changing yourself is not necessarily a bad thing, that thinking differently could make them better human beings, but could also make them successful in the world. So these are some of the strategies that I use in a literature classroom. And as I pointed out, all of this is based in my experience, but also based in when I went exploring to read, what does so and so say about it? What techniques has someone else used? So philosophy and praxis, reading it, absorbing it, and then picking from it what I could mobilize usefully in my classes. That has been my strategy. Okay. So yes, walk in, right? Sounds like psychotherapy, cognitive. if you read Mark Bracker, that is absolutely, he relies a lot on psychology, especially Lacanian psychoanalysis and all. It is not necessarily like total behaviorism, because the way I do it, I'm not trying to program my students to change. The problem with B.F. Skinner and others was that they claimed that through incentives and coercion, they could literally rewrite a brain to do. Remember B.F. Skinner famously saying that we can actually teach a mouse how to fly a plane. So it is not in that extreme form, not behaviorist in that sense, but behaviorist in a sense that it at least presupposes that part of our job is not to modify the behavior of our students, but to encourage them to think differently about their own self as they read literature. But you're absolutely right. When Stanley Fish responded to Mark Bracker's book, Radical Pedagogy, he basically said that it comes across as brainwashing, right? But that is obviously a complete misreading of what Mark Bracker is trying to do. But that's why when I have conversations with Mark, and he's my mentor and I deeply respect him, I tell him that I follow these techniques, but not too intrusively, because I have to be also careful to assume that I don't know what all I believe in is absolutely right or not, right? I have to always share it tentatively, right? And with a certain degree of humility. And I've realized that works in my classes, because when you tell your students, hey, I don't have all the answers, right? I believe in this because of this, and this is my politics. If it doesn't do the same thing for you, that's okay, right? But there's another thing that I've learned from Mark, and that is that in any given text or any given scenario, we can always sometimes point to what we call the commonalities of human experience, right? And if we can draw those out and ask our students to opine on those or think about that, chances are that that commonality of experience would enable them to develop more empathetic selves. Now, remember, empathy is different from sympathy, right? Sympathy is what you feel for people you consider unfortunate, right? Empathy is when you can feel alongside others, right? Regardless of what your own cultural or economic position is. So when you're trying to develop empathy, it is based in compassion, but also in understanding, right? And so in that sense, if you were to like go technically trying to rewrite the brains of your students, absolutely it would be sort of a psychotherapy and behavioralism. But as far as my practice is concerned, I try to be careful not to come across as this technician of the brain. But I agree with you, it sounds like that. So I have a question. What do you think about teaching via means of graphic novel? I mean, I think they work great. I've never taught one, but I have colleagues who actually teach full courses on graphic novels. They write about graphic novels, both text-based as well as, on a screen. So I think it can be a wonderful thing. I mean, if you pick up Persepolis and teach it, or Palestine, or any other graphic novel, you can do the same thing with it, absolutely. And it will probably be more powerful because you will also have the visual images, right? So what are your thoughts on world literature as critical pedagogy? So, I mean, there are a lot of huge critiques of world literature. I am myself a critic of some practices. Now, the world literature courses got introduced in American bachelor's programs post 1990s. And that was the idea, was to disrupt what the traditional model was. The traditional model in the English department was that people had to take two continental lit courses, one continental literature 1 and continental literature 2, and those covered all the European authors. But post 1990s, the curriculum changes shifted So the history departments, instead of teaching Western Civ, started teaching World History 1, World History 2. The English departments shifted to World Literature 1 and 2. So each undergraduate has to take 2 World Literature courses. So on a surface level, that is great because they are at least being exposed to literatures from different parts of the world. The problem in teaching those courses is that there are no one can be an expert in world literature. I am not an expert in world literature. And that those texts, like those courses, are also assigned to people who are underpaid and overworked, right? So it kind of loses its power. But still, in comparison of having just the European literature taught or world literature taught, maybe imperfectly, which one would I choose? Obviously, I will choose the world literature because it at least has the possibility of exposing our students to more than just the Western literature, right? Okay, Harry, I am a teacher of age 10 to 11 children. I've looked at Paulo Freire a lot as I'm doing an assignment on that. Have you got any advice or strategies that could be implemented into? Harry, I might not have some advice, but if you look up, of course, you're aware of Henry Giroux, right? But my colleague and friend, Kenneth Saltman has some wonderful books on it, right? But if you just do a search on critical pedagogy and Henry Giroux, these are the people who actually specialize in classroom practices of K-12 system. And you may not agree with all of their assumptions, but what it will enable you to do is to read as to what do these people think the role of public education is, and then go from there. But personally, having not taught in the K-12 system, and I absolutely salute you for doing that, I think these people would be a good start for you. Especially Kenneth Saltman, because he has book on the K-12 system, a couple of books, and Henry Giroux. And they are the ones who will be very useful to you. One knowledge that I can share, it comes from a book by, a book by John Tagg, which is called The Learning Paradigm College, which is about college, but you can apply it at the school level. And one thing that he discusses in there, which is someone else's research, but I think it highly can be useful in a K-12 class system, in how to respond to students. And what he teaches us that there are two kind of identities that young students inhabit. One is this group of students who believe, without knowing it, of course, in entity theory of identity, and the others believe in what he calls identity in flux. And knowing the difference enables us to administer course materials and education better. And how do we know the difference? If you have a student who turns in an essay or a small assignment and you put notes on it and give them suggestions and everything else, and they come back and they're offended and they're crying and there's like, this is sad, right? Then you can assume that this student believes in entity theory of self, which means that they believe that they are complete unto themselves. So the work that they produce then becomes an extension of themselves. So when you comment on it, they see it as a critique of their own self. And that's why they're offended and distraught, right? If a student comes to you and says, oh, I am so grateful, you gave me some really good comments, then you already know that this student has internalized this idea that herself, the structure of it is constantly in flux and constantly growing, and that you, by commenting on her paper, are enabling her to do that. Just knowing these two things coming from pedagogy theory will enable you to at least read the responses of your students to your feedback, right? More importantly, there is this belief system in old school educational that we have to break apart our students' identities and reconstruct them. That is the most destructive thing we can do in a classroom. Okay. And there's a reason behind it. When our students walk into our classroom, they are anxious about their social identity, but all their energies in a classroom in the first time when you have not earned their trust are being focused on protecting their identity, whatever it is, right? And anything that is said or pointing at them or saying their name, the first thing that they perceive is whether it's threatening to their self or not, right? That's how deeply it's ingrained in our consciousness. And so if you create a classroom environment where that anxiety is lowered, where they feel like I am safe, myself is not under threat, then and only then will they open up to learning, because their energies are now not being spent on protecting that self, but they know that their anxiety level is low, right? And then they can go learning. So the teachers who believe that we need to discipline our students and tell them their pants are not right and all, if you start a class like that with a student, right, you cannot expect that that student will sit for 40 minutes learning. No, that student is recovering from that trauma, that immediate trauma in the classroom. So these little things I can add to, but with an acknowledgement that my wife was valiant enough to teach in the K-12 system. I have never had the privilege of doing it, but those who do it here, elsewhere in the world, I have deep, deep respect for them, because it is a hard job. It is a rewarding job, but it is a hard job. The teachers are not paid well, and so many times they're not even respected. So it is a vocation, and I'm so grateful that you're doing that. So Harry, you are from UK. So yes, I mean, I think you're on a right track, but the problem with the high school system is you have to work with so many powerful constituencies. At college, parents have no say in how I teach. But when you are in the K-12 system, you also have to deal with parents. You have to deal with school administrators, right? So the idea would be then to develop a kind of pedagogy that doesn't fall foul of the parents, right, or the administrators, but still delivers something to the students that is more than just the average. And yes, it is Henry Giroux. I could be pronouncing it wrong, but yes. So Harry, it's Henry Giroux, Giroux, and Kenneth Saltman. And what I'll do is when I upload an edited version of this, I will list some of the books that I think are really useful for teachers at all level. I'll find the links to them. Okay, so Harry, if you don't know my name, it's Masood Raja. You can call me Masood, you can call me Dr. Masood Raja, but welcome, right? Okay, so I think I have talked a lot, so now I will look through the questions, but if you have any questions or suggestions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Okay, so this interface seems to be working well. As I pointed out, I'm using just the direct YouTube live stream this time instead of using StreamYard. And the problem we had in StreamYard was that the comments would not display immediately. So I'm grateful that they're showing really. Okay, so AC, Dr. Raja, can you answer my follow-up question about world literature above, please? Okay, let me look it up. AC. What are your thoughts on world literature as critical pedagogy? I think I did answer it, but let me see. What do you feel will or should replace world literature in the classroom? That's a really good question. I think, I mean, there's a wonderful book by Amir Mufti, uh, Forget English. It's a critique of world literature. I would not want it replaced because, I mean, the alternative is going back to continental lit courses. What I would try to do is that instead of teaching world literature surveys, which no one is a specialist in, I would rather encourage the departments and professors to develop focused world literature courses. And we do that. At my institution, we have a general world literature course, World Lit 1 and World Lit 2. And then we have slightly higher level world literature courses in which you can focus on South Asian literature, literature from the Muslim world or literature from China and Korea. So I would rather have more world lit courses, but acknowledging that the professors who are assigned to teach them usually are our lecturers and they are underpaid and overworked. So maybe give them, a course off or pay them more, but also eventually encourage the professors and teachers to develop world lit courses, but which either have a genre focus or a regional focus, so that it's not so expensive. Because technically, there is no way you can teach world literature, right? I mean, you have to make your choices, and no one is an expert in it. So that these are some of the things that will have to be kept in mind. Okay, Harry, thank you. Yeah, I think I show up on Google. Okay, all right. Yes, I mean, I see for quite a few of our world literature courses here use translations. If I am using right now, this is the reader I'm using for my world lit classes. And, if there is a story by Li Shun, it is translated. There is a Garcia Marquez story, which is in translation. There is Carlos Fuentes story, which is in translation. There is a story by Rokaya Shaukat Hussain. I mean, Sultana's Dream, she wrote it in English. So, yeah, I mean, it can be in original languages, but for our English speaking, students, they have to be in translation. So, Harry, I found you through your chapter review of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Is the book worth reading? Absolutely. I mean, you may not agree with all that he's saying, and it's slightly dated, but I find it to be an inspirational text. I mean, in terms of thinking pedagogy. Some of it might not be practical, but that's the reason I started doing, I was going to just do like chapter abstracts. And then I realized, no, that's not doing justice to the book. So that's why on my channel, I actually developed a whole series where I read parts of the book and then talk about it. So we have so far finished 2 chapters, and we are on the 3rd chapter. Actually, I just recorded page 104. So my hope is to have recordings of the whole book with me reading it and then discussing it. And then after I've done that, then also focus on certain concepts that he invokes and talks about and develop more supplemental materials. But my hope is that after I'm done with it, for my own sake, not that I will have created a comprehensive video resource on reading and talking about pedagogy of the oppressed. So I highly recommend it. So Christine, not a question, but I just want to thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, and I'm delighted that you find it useful. As I always remind people in these lectures, but also in my videos, This might come across as a public service. Yes, maybe it is, but you cannot imagine how important your recognition is to me, okay, personally, as a scholar and as a teacher. Because these exchanges that I'm having with you now, or someone commenting on a video, they mean a lot to me. Because remember, I'm a theorist of pedagogy. I'm a theorist of how we develop our identities, and recognition is a huge part of it. Think of it this way: at your workplace, when your colleagues or bosses or seniors want to diminish you, they don't always say, I'm going to dock your pay. No, the best way of diminishing you or hurting you is when they withhold recognition from you, right? When you do something and they don't even acknowledge, or they don't even look at you as they walk you by. So that teaches you that recognition, acknowledgement of our others, right, is hugely important, right? So because of these exchanges with you, right, selfishly speaking, I get that recognition, that gift, which, Bakhtin would call it, that the self is a gift thrown across by the other, right? So I am deeply grateful to all of you who attend these sessions, but who also take the time to, watch a video and let me know, that it helped them, or even post a question or anything. So thank you so much for that. So AC, how do you go about choosing the best translations and editions? Because they all aren't the same, it seems. Well, that is why for my lower division classes, I created my own reader. I picked up stories that I wanted to teach and essays from different books, and I bound them together, and that is what I use. Because part of it isn't just what is in a story. Part of it, any reader that you choose, is combined with what you prefer as a teacher and how you teach it. But instead of assigning a 3-volume anthology on world literature, I just read through 6-7 different publishers' anthologies and picked 30 or 35 texts that I thought I could teach more effectively, and I put it together, and that's what I use. Matthias, I very much appreciate those video series where you are reading the book and discussing. Very enlightening. Thank you so much. And there are 2 going on right now. We are reading Orientalism and Paulo Freire. And I might add another one after we get towards the conclusion of Paulo Freire. So thank you so much. AC, your videos have been used in one of my MA comparative literature course at King's College here in London. Wow, that's quite a great compliment. Would you mind sharing who used it? But that is great. Thank you. I would love to thank your professor. Like the above, amazing being able to talk to someone like you about these topics. Really helpful. You are welcome, Harry. And please join us next time as well. The topic might not be as focused to your area of interest, but we do have some, as I pointed out earlier, we do have open sessions where we just answer each other's questions. And as far as a course about pedagogy, there is a whole playlist on pedagogy, but I'll see maybe I can develop a series of lectures that are focused on pedagogy, literature pedagogy. So I'll put it on my list. Aisha, thank you so much, Aisha. And then Lauren, I love your channel and you've helped my understanding of post-colonial theory. Where could I contact you to ask you some specific questions? So the best way to contact me is through my email. I can put it here, but it's also listed under the About page of the channel, and it is here. But even better is when we do an open session on research or any other question answer, you can send me your question in advance through the comment section or through the community tab. And that way I can prepare it and I can give you a comprehensive answer, which can be useful to others as well. Okay. Okay. And then I have. So AC, okay, yes, that's great. Please convey my thanks to her. Okay, Hafiz, sir, easy way to understand Shakespeare's works. Well, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. My wife is a Shakespeare scholar. But what I would suggest is it depends on which text you use. Okay. I have the Oxford Shakespeare anthology of all the plays sitting right there, which I used for my master's. And the reason I call it easier reading is because it adds a lot of editorial glosses there. Any archaic word is explained there. So I would highly recommend that. But other than that, I mean, just reading the scholars, basic readers that have tried to explain the plays. But it depends on what level you are studying. If it is just an undergraduate course, maybe just an anthology with annotations would be more helpful. If you are working on a higher level of abstraction, then that will depend on the institution and what do they want you to read. But in either case, the Norton Shakespeare based on Oxford is the one that I read from and I use. You can use the Oxford Shakespeare anthology. All of them give you the histories of each play, some scholarly works about it, and then they also give you inline annotations and notes that explain certain archaic words. So I would highly recommend that. AC, I have a question about post-colonial theory studies. Some argue that we are not post-colonial. Well, watch my videos on post-colonialism. No one in post-colonial studies believes that post in the post-colonial studies is actually a temporal marker. Right? It was an imperfect term that was coined in the 1990s, but no self-loving worthy scholar of post-colonial studies will ever tell you that colonialism or imperialism is over. So that is always a question that comes up, and people want answers on that, but we have answered it pretty convincingly. And anyone who does post-colonial studies will basically tell you that. But if you look at my playlist on the course on post-colonialism, the very first 3 lectures, we actually went through these criticisms by some leading scholars of the 1990s who had challenged post-colonialism. And we discussed them and talked about them. And I think the links to the actual essays are also there. You can read them too. Good, Harry. So critical pedagogy and global literature. Yeah, I mean, the book, it's not a popular book, but every major library has it. We never make any money out of academic books, but some leading scholars of critical pedagogy, who also happen to be friends of mine, did contribute some really good essays in it. And what I did was I had gathered commitments from established scholars, but also some emerging scholars. So it has a good mixture of people who are very well established in the field of critical pedagogy, and then people who were emerging and studying. So it's a good collection. Not a perfect book, of course. No book is perfect. But yes, in terms of scholarly usage, people have used it and people have read it. But it's an edited volume. It doesn't have a lot of my own insights in it, other than the introduction that I wrote and the people that I brought together. So, Harry, my webinars usually are always on Saturdays at 10 o'clock US daylight time, Texas mountain time, whatever. And they're usually focused on one topic or the other, but sometimes we do a general question answer session where people bring their questions and we just talk about them. And they are announced on the community page of the channel. So if you're subscribed to the channel, you'll get a notification whenever I create a webinar. It goes into our record, it generates a notification. But if you also join our Facebook page, which is Postcolonial Space, Facebook group actually, then of course I post it there too. Then I also post it on my Twitter account, which is @Masood Raja. It's pretty simple. That's my Twitter handle. So I also post these announcements on Twitter. So by and large, there are more than 3 platforms on which we announce the upcoming webinars. Right? Infinita, please, Dr. Raja, I'd like you to do a video on the term interpellation. Absolutely. I can do that. I mean, I can briefly explain it here, but I can, let me read a little more, because people usually use it incorrectly. So absolutely, give me a week or so and let me read a little more, and then I will record a short video on it. Thank you for suggesting it. Okay, Matthias. Recently read Benjamin's Task of the Translator. At one point, he postulates that a presumably good translation could serve to bring out aspects of the original text, like fragments of a vessel. Yeah, I mean, I see value in translation. I mean, there are people who are cultural purists, and they say that a translation. But there's a wonderful book by Amy Epster on untranslatability. It's somewhere on my shelf here. And in which she talks about the act of translation, but also acknowledging that we need to account for the untranslatability of a text as well, that there are certain things that absolutely cannot be translated, right? But here is the thing. Would you rather have a translation? Last week, I taught this in my graduate seminar. If I taught it in original, not many of you could read it, right? So what did I have instead? I had the author's own transcreated version of it, River of Fire, right? The greatest 20th century Urdu novel. Now, I was able to do that because she transcreated it. It's not a replica of the original. It can never capture the sense of the original, the feeling of the original. But it gives me a 480-page book written by a female Indian author, which is an epic story of India. So that's the possibilities of a translation, right? It creates that space for us. Now, depending on who's teaching it, how do they teach it, will have a bearing upon it. But I would rather have translations than just delve into this purist fantasy that everyone should be able to read it in the original languages. Not everyone in the world has the privilege enough or the resources enough to become an expert, right, in languages. So, imperfect as they are, I consider translations highly worthy of our time in a classroom. Do you think there is a value to the view, or are translations eternally to be seen? No, so I think I already answered that. No, I don't see them as secondary. Look, the only place where they will become secondary is if Masood Raja decides I am going to write a book on River of Fire, right, as a scholar, right? At that level of abstraction. Now, if I am going to write about the River of Fire, and if I really call myself a scholar, I will then deal with the original, right? I will have to. Now, do European scholars do that? Absolutely not. I mean, they can get away with it. I had a colleague somewhere from Europe, I'm not going to name her, a few years ago, she had a book chapter on this. And she sent me a query about whether or not I thought Kurratullain Haider was a modernist, was considered a modernist writer or not. And I told her, my first question was, have you read the Urdu version? And she said, no. And I said, the opening lines of the Urdu version here is where she translates T.S. Eliot's The Three Salvages. That's where the title of the novel comes from, the analogy of the river. Now, at that level of abstraction, absolutely, I would expect a scholar to know the original language and then write about it. But if you're a student, and if I am an underpaid graduate student teaching a world lit class, or even a lecturer with a temporary job, I mean, expecting that out of them would be absurd, right? But does it create a classroom experience that can be slightly more enriching than just teaching them British literature? Absolutely. So I think we have to look at these things and their value contextually as to who is doing it and for what purpose, right? Okay, I have here Samuel. Thank you for putting in the time and effort to explain postcolonialism. Could you please tell us more about identity and how postcolonial theory contributes to the concept of identity in a unique way? I could, but we'll be spending a whole more hour on it. So I think maybe I'll put it on the list in Finita's suggestion about interpolation and identity. And maybe someday I can either record something on it or we can do a live webinar. But if you go to my post-colonial concepts playlist and any other playlist, the question of identity is there, invoked under different terms, right? The best would be if you watch my webinar on radical pedagogy, Ela Mark Bracker. It's a 1-hour webinar in which the question of identity, not post-colonialist, but general psychological identity and its construction is what we have discussed. So that would be the ideal place to do it. But I put it on my list to see if I can record something specific to that. So beneath core, oh yes, we are live. Yeah, this is not a recording. Okay. So AC, yes, I agree with you. Different, any act of translation isn't just a literal transcribing of the old text to the new text. The translator brings his or her politics, his or her way of reading a text with it. Some translations are highly creative and people go after them because they get so far removed from the original. You can see that in the translations of Odyssey, Iliad, the differences, the different choices that people make. I think the most important thing is to remember that the translation itself is a creative act, right? And it has the subjectivity and the politics of the translator inscribed in it, no matter how much you may try to render yourself transparent, but it will show, right? And it's important to keep that in mind. So thank you. I mean, we have quite a lot of people and some really good questions. And so by and large, I mean, I'll conclude the topic and then maybe pause for a few questions. So keep in mind that it is up to you to decide what you think literature pedagogy ought to be, right? So if you believe that it's only about giving our students the skills to reading and writing about it and answering questions about it, that is fine. That is your prerogative and your privilege. If you believe that literature can be mobilized to teach our students about the text, but also about their own selves and about their role and responsibility to their local and global others, then you are in the realm of critical pedagogy, radical pedagogy. And in order to do that, I would highly encourage you to then develop a repertoire of understanding how critical pedagogy works, how best to deliver it, but most importantly, to enter an act of teaching, not from top down, but with humility and with respect for your students, their feelings, their ways of thinking, right? And their modes of experiencing the text. If we do that, then maybe we can create a literature classroom which can be exciting, where we can discuss the aesthetics and then take it beyond the classroom to their life in the world. And that's the kind of literature pedagogy that I believe in, that I try to learn every day, and that I practice. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you so much, as always, and see if there are any other questions. So Beneath Kaur, from your last name, can you speak Punjabi? Hello, sir. I'm a final year student of University of Delhi, and your recordings on Eagleton and Postcolonialism do help me a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. ਤੇ ਅਗਰ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪੰਜਾਬੀ ਆਂਦੀ ਹੈ ਤੇ welcome. Sorry. Every time I see like someone from that region of, Punjab of Pakistan or India, it kind of, my heart warms up. So, okay. All right. So I guess we can end it here. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, I'm grateful, and I will announce what we'll be doing next week. But Infinita, I have your topic on interpolation on my list. I will try to reread a little more and then record a video on it. And the question of identity, I forgot whose suggestion was that. We'll see if we can do just a whole webinar on it. So I'll keep that in mind. Oh, great. So Vineet ji, welcome. Ji Ayanu. Okay, Infinita, peace and love. So please join us next week. And thank you so much. And I will beg your leave. And I will now see you next week. Okay? Peace and love.